Good morning.
Morning.
All right, I have a gift for you today. Let's see. I am going to give you some piece of furniture. Could be a desk. It could be a chair. Could be all kinds of things. Would you like that? You don't know if you like it or not? Maybe you could build a wagon out of it. Anyway, here it is. You keep that, and someday it might be a piece of furniture. What did I give you? An acorn. So, see, now you've got it all figured out, don't you?
Maybe, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what the metaphor is here.
Okay, well, you tell me what the metaphor is.
Okay. I think it's about how, when you, about patience in some form.
Okay.
And how,
What are you going to have to do with the acorn?
sell it, preferably. Or you can turn it to acorn butter.
Oh, you're going to do acorn butter while you are going to furniture then. What did you say? They can what? If you leave them on the ground, they'll die. Well, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they get buried in the soil. And what happens?
They thrive.
What kind of a tree do you get out of an acorn?
Oak.
Oh, okay. Well, is there any, somebody tell me, are there any oak furniture in this place? Is that oak? All right, well, let's assume that it is for the time being. See, that's the kind of thing you make out of a big oak tree. And there's a lot of metaphors you can make out of this. If you take something and you plant it, and there was a story about this acorn that was talking to a bird. I mean, it's this old story, children's story. And the bird doesn't believe the acorn says he's going to be a mighty tree someday. And she said, "Whoa, you're so small, you'll amount to nothing." And I said, "Oh yes, I will. I'm going to be a big tree someday. People will sleep underneath the tree and be shaded and be protected from the sun and the rain by my arms." And the bird said, "You think really you can do that?" And the acorn says, "Yeah, I can do it with God's help." All right, now we'll do another metaphor. You're kind of acorns, right? You're kind of small in terms of persons. Yeah, you're practically you're nice. We're just little. We sometimes think we can't do much. And if we think that we want to become something that will help people in the future and help God's world, we can be a farmer or a doctor or a minister or a shopkeeper. All these things, all we can become if we grow up and we let God help us to become what He wants us to be. And we might look like little acorns now, but someday we could be mighty oak trees. Give Him a hand, please. in the 2nd chapter of Luke, beginning at the 5th verse. When some were speaking about the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and gifts dedicated to God, Jesus said, "As for these things that you see, the days will come when not one stone will be left upon the other, and all will be thrown down." They asked him, "Teacher, when will this be? And what will be the sign that this is about to take place?" And he said, "Beware that you are not led astray, for many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and the time is near. Do not go after them. When you hear of wars and insurrections, do not be terrified, for these things must take place first. But the end will not follow immediately." Then he said to them, "Nation will rise up against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, and in various places famines and plagues. And there will be dreadful portions and great signs from heaven. But before this all occurs, they will arrest you and persecute you. They will hand you over to the synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before the kings and governors because of my name. This will give you an opportunity to testify. So make up your minds not to prepare your defense in advance, for I will give you the words and a wisdom that none of your opponents will be able to withstand or contradict. You'll be betrayed, even by parents and brothers, by relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. You'll be hated by all who because of my name. But not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance, you will gain your soul." Here ends the gospel for the day. Please be seated. There is a manufacturing plant in London, England, by the name of Volotech that has created an apocalypse jacket. An apocalypse, as you know, an apocalypse predicts the end of the world, usually in some kind of catastrophic form. This jacket is made together with what they call ballistic body armor, certain things that were given to them by NASA, and it is virtually indestructible. You can take hot lava directly from the volcano, put it on that jacket, and it will not destroy it. Also, sulfuric acid will not even touch it. Kind of makes you a little excited, doesn't it? To know that there is something that powerful, that is that resistance to an attack. I would like to have a full body sheet of that. And it's not that heavy, I guess. The idea of a disaster coming, something that is unrecognizable in its bigness, and its propensity to destroy us, and to think that we can overcome it with something as simple as an apocalypse jacket. Kind of fits into that whole idea of the disaster movies. I don't know how many of you like those kind of movies, but they do pretty well at the box office. Independence Day is probably the most lucrative of all the disaster movies that we've seen at the theaters. The man who directed that said, we like to see destruction all over. Destruction that seems to encompass the whole world, and then we see people coming and rescuing us from it. That's kind of exciting. Professor William Dixon of Nebraska said, people like to go to disaster movies to prove they can go through the worst possible experience and somehow feel like they're immortal. Now you think about that for a minute. That fits in real nicely with our text. In our text today, our gospel text, Jesus is taking the apostles to the temple. The temple in Jerusalem is a magnificent structure. It's the second one that was built. It is the place where God dwells as far as Judaism is concerned. The thought of it never being there is not really on the minds of the apostles or any of the other people that are watching Jesus at this time. They just sit and admire the structure. And then Jesus looks at them and he said, there's going to be a time when not one piece of this building will be on top of the other, not one stone upon the other. It'll be decimated. They couldn't believe that. That's where God dwells. This is a holy place. And yet Jesus is saying it's going to be destroyed. And they found out that that was true because 30 years after that, it was destroyed entirely. Never rebuilt. The idea of catastrophe is something that we like to wrestle with a little bit in the movies, but we don't like it when it hits us. And sometimes we look at things and think that disaster is among us. And we have a lot of fear. But just as Jesus said to the apostles, after he told them that the temple would totally be destroyed, and their center of worship decimated, and they would be spread out, and they too would become victims of attacks from people because they were carrying his name. They were proclaiming the name of Jesus. He said, yeah, there might be disaster, and things might get worse. But God's plans will persevere, and you must have hope in the time of adversity. So that's the lesson. That's the central theme of today's gospel text. Things might get worse, but you believe in Jesus and his purpose. You believe in God's purpose, and things will be made right. You must have hope and faith that God will persevere. A couple of ideas we get from the text. And the first one is this. Vision without hope is dangerous. But vision with hope will carry us through. A hopeless future where we have no vision. We become fearful, anxious, angry, controlling. But with hope, our vision becomes love, joy, peace, patience, goodness, self-control. In the epistle lessons, Paul says, God's plan is to bring everything in creation under the authority of Jesus Christ. So it is perfectly normal to have hope if you believe in the message of Jesus Christ. Jeffrey Emmett became the CEO of General Electric on September 10th, 2011. Became the CEO of one of the biggest corporations, one that determines how the stock market is measured day by day. On September 11th, you know what happened. The Twin Towers were driven into by airplanes, destroyed. The stock market went totally downhill. People were confined to their homes. The airplanes quit flying. There were only military planes above, and the president was put someplace in Nebraska. I guess they don't think anybody will find anybody in Nebraska. But it was terrorists. We're terrorists. GE had all the insurance. GE Capital had all the insurance on the Twin Towers. And they had massive losses the day after he took over as CEO. It was a tough pill to swallow, and sometimes he said he had wished that he had not had that honor of being selected to be the CEO of GE. But he said there were some powerful lessons that he learned. He said if you're going to be a true leader, you have to be able to absorb the fear of the people. Without the tendency not to be realistic, but also be realistic about the possibility that their lives would be altered and they would have to make a lot of sacrifices. But he persevered in the faith. You absorb the fear of the people, and things will right themselves. He said, I learned to say to people, things might get worse. But I have a dream. I have a dream that at the end, all will be made much better than it was before we started. And the second thing I say is, I will not lose faith in that dream. It seems so long in the past, and we can no longer imagine what it was like. We've forgotten, those of us who experienced 9/11, we've forgotten most of it. We know there was a trouble, but the terror that was there at that time, it was somehow probably hard to imagine where we are today. In spite of the problems that we have, in spite of the fact that sometimes things are totally out of whack as far as God's plan is concerned, the ones who had vision and hope helped make us through. And things probably are better than they were then. The second thing he said we learn is if we have hope, we can have hope if we make up our mind to see the future as Jesus sees it. Paul instructs us to have the mind of Christ. And the one thing about Christ is he really never looked back. He was always looking toward the future. And a future that was filled with the fulfillment of the purpose for which he came to earth. The salvation of mankind. That never disappeared. Although it seemed like for a moment he was not real happy that he'd been given this task. In the Garden of Gethsemane he prayed, Lord, if you can take this cup of suffering away from me, so be it. But nevertheless, mine will be done. Thy will be done. To develop the mind of Christ, to look at the present, sometimes when it is challenging, and say I have a dream and I have a vision for the future, and I will work to make it happen. This week, we had another major hurricane in Florida. They hadn't recovered from the last one just a few weeks ago. But once again, the newspapers and the television cameras were out to capture the destruction. And I was particularly enthralled by a discussion that he had with one of the people that lived on the east coast of Florida. And what they showed him doing was doing some finishing touches on his residence. Some tin or steel or whatever it was. He said he had it all covered. This is the last one to put on. And they asked him if he was going to leave. And he said, no, there's no reason for me to leave. They said, well, you're going to be hit. You're kind of in the path. You're in the eye, going to be in the eye of that hurricane. And he said, it's no big deal. I live down here. I'm prepared for this. I'm secure. You going to leave the island? No, I've never left the island. I said, what are you going to do tonight? He said, well, since we might not have power, I've had a couple of good books that I can read till I'm ready to go to sleep. But you see, I have to get up in the morning and take my boat and go out and find the people that stayed that hadn't been prepared as well as I was. That's a task that God put me in the morning. Everybody else was looking at destruction and the terror. And he was preparing how to help people in the morning after it was over. Because he'd gone through this before, but he was prepared. Somebody asked me the other day, he said, did you see the report the seminary gave on what would happen to the denominational churches in the next 30 years? He said, they're saying they will not exist in 30 years. And I said, well, God must have a plan. Maybe the plan is to get us together, because this denominational stuff is dumb anyway. You got to look at the possibilities that God has. God won't let his kingdom fail. He won't let his message fail. He won't let you fail if you believe that you look with the same mind that Christ had. That whatever the catastrophe is, and whatever it looks like we're going downhill now, God has some plan where it'll come better at the end. Third thing we learned from this text this morning is we can have hope if we view the trials as an opportunity to witness to the truth of God. We had an election this week, and one group said, if the other people win the day, democracy is dead. And the other group said, if the other group wins, democracy will be dead. They both said that somehow or other, democracy would be dead. Well, it's almost a week past election, and democracy looks pretty healthy to me. I think that things will come out just as they should. Because the trials of right now are simply incentives for us to get things together, to work together and make things better. That's what adversity is all about, isn't it? Christ said, I'm going to Jerusalem to suffer many things. And Peter said, no, you're not. And Jesus said, I have to go, so get behind me, Satan. So when people begin to tell you that everything is going amok, everything is going wrong, God is somehow in the midst of it, it will turn out better. It will turn out according to his plan. It will turn out according to your salvation. I know I used this illustration once before, but there was a story of a farmer who put out an ad for help. And he asked for responses. He got a number of responses. One he liked particularly well, but he was a little awed by one of the things he'd written in the paper that he'd sent him about the job. And the question was asked, what is your particular gift? And this particular person who had applied for the job said, I sleep well in storms. We didn't really know what that meant, didn't ask him, but he liked him anyway, so we hired him. And then one night there was a terrible storm, and he said, the farmer got up and said, man, he said, I don't see any light on over there. I don't see any activity from my worker. And he said, we need to get all the animals in. We got to need secure things that might blow away. He went over to the place where he was staying and found him sleeping. And he said, I looked out, and all the cattle were in. All the things that could blow away were secured. Everything was just as it should have been, prepared for the storm. Now I know what he meant by the statement, I sleep well in a storm. And I'm sure some of you today are involved in somewhat of a storm. There's been suffering in so many lives. But the commitment to have a vision that God's will is going to be done. To know that without hope there is no vision. But with hope, and the hope and the promises of God, all things are possible. We can have hope if we see the future through the eyes of Jesus. Things might get worse, but in the end, God will triumph. And we can have hope if we view these trials that we are experiencing today as a part of God's holy plan to make things better in His kingdom. Prepare yourselves to sleep well in the storm. Amen. Sermon hymn is 62, I Surrender All. Stand as you are able, 62.